On the morning of February 28, 2026, 11 American F-22 Raptors, sitting on the tarmac at Ovda Air Base in Israel's southern Negev desert, did something they had never done before in the history of the aircraft. They flew into contested skies over Iran, threading a web of surface-to-air missile batteries and radar sites, and according to multiple defense outlets tracking the operation. Not one of them was detected. That is the moment this story is built around. Not a rumor, not a threat, but a documented combat operation that used the most expensive air superiority fighter ever built by the United States to open the door for everything that came after it. To understand how the world's most advanced stealth fighter ended up parked less than an hour's flight from Iranian airspace, you have to go back a few weeks earlier to the collapse of a negotiation that nobody in Washington or Tehran wanted to admit was already dead. For months leading into February 2026, American and Iranian negotiators had been circling the same unresolved question that has defined this relationship for over a decade: uranium enrichment. According to reporting from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the Trump administration's position was unambiguous: no enrichment, full stop, along with restrictions on Iran's ballistic missile program and its support for regional proxy groups. Tehran's negotiators refused to accept a deal on those terms. On February 17, 2026, those talks formally collapsed. Within hours, American military assets that had spent weeks quietly repositioning began to move with a different kind of urgency. Flight tracking analysts and open-source intelligence accounts documented a wave of F-22 Raptors, F-16 Fighting Falcons, E-3 Sentry radar aircraft, and a U-2 Dragon Lady spy plane converging on the Middle East, a mobilization. The week described, citing flight data, as one of the largest air power surges toward the region in years. The first visible marker came at RAF Lakenheath in the United Kingdom, a base that has long served as a refueling and staging point for American fighters crossing the Atlantic toward Central Command's area of responsibility. On February 17th, 6 F-22 Raptors from Langley Air Force Base touched down there, according to The Aviationist, which tracks military aviation movements in near real time. Just 1 week later, on February 24th, the picture escalated sharply. 12 F-22 Raptors departed Lakenheath under the escort of 3 KC-46A Pegasus tankers and a KC-135 Stratotanker, heading toward the Central Command Theater, according to Army Recognition, which cited open-source flight tracking data, and Defense OSINT accounts monitoring the formation in real time. Analysts described the deployment as a calibrated signal. Not necessarily a declaration of imminent war, but a demonstration that Washington was willing to move its scarcest, most technologically advanced air-to-air platform within immediate striking distance of Iran. That destination turned out to be Ovda Air Base, an airfield roughly 40 kilometers north of Eilat in Israel's southern Negev desert. It was chosen, according to Defense Security Asia, partly because Israel had closed its own squadron there in 2025, leaving behind dozens of empty hardened aircraft shelters that could absorb an American fighter wing without requiring new construction. Commercial satellite imagery reviewed by 1945 confirmed the presence of 11 F-22 Raptors at Ovda shortly after their transit from staging points in Europe. One aircraft had reportedly turned back early during the initial movement because of a technical issue, a detail underscoring just how demanding this aircraft is to operate and maintain even under peacetime conditions. This was, by every account tracking it, the first operational combat-oriented deployment of American stealth fighters to Israeli soil during the current period of tension over Iran's nuclear ambitions. The politics around the deployment were handled carefully, but not quietly. According to Air and Space Forces magazine, senior Israeli officials, including the commander of the Israeli Air Force, visited American personnel stationed at Ovda to coordinate operational activity. And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reportedly inspected the aircraft himself, a symbolic gesture underlining the depth of military cooperation between the two countries. U.S. Central Command, for its part, declined to comment publicly on the deployment when contacted by Air and Space Forces magazine, which is standard practice for movements of this sensitivity. What officials didn't say publicly, retired military leaders were willing to say on the record. During a webinar hosted by the Jewish Institute for National Security of America in late May, a former general identified as Guastella described the forward positioning of F-22s in Israel as, in his words, a very clear deterrent signal that allows the United States to negotiate with strength. That framing, deterrence through positioning, not necessarily combat, is important context, because it's easy to look at a stealth fighter arriving in a war zone and assume conflict is inevitable. In this case, deployment and combat ended up arriving almost simultaneously. It's worth pausing here to establish something the audience should understand clearly. This was not the first time F-22s had been used in operations tied to Iran. According to Air and Space Forces magazine, F-22 Raptors had already played a role in escorting B-2 Spirit stealth bombers during Operation Midnight Hammer in June 2025, when American aircraft struck Iranian nuclear facilities directly. What made the February 2026 movement historically distinct wasn't that F-22s were suddenly involved in Iran-related operations for the first time. It was that, for the first time, they were forward-based on Israeli soil itself, rather than flying long-range missions from bases further away. That distinction matters operationally. Positioning F-22s at Ovda still leaves them a considerable distance from Iranian targets. Reporting from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies noted that aircraft flying from Israel would need to traverse Syrian, Iraqi, Jordanian, or Saudi airspace to avoid a long and circuitous route, which is part of why a half-dozen KC-46 and KC-135 refueling tankers were also spotted converging on Ben Gurion International Airport around the same time. Distance and fuel, even for the most advanced fighter in the American arsenal, remain a hard physical constraint that no amount of stealth technology can erase. By February 27th, the broader picture of the buildup had become impossible to ignore. Air and Space Forces magazine reported that roughly 30 F-35A Lightning IIs from Lakenheath's 48th Fighter Wing and the Vermont Air National Guard's 158th Fighter Wing had deployed to a base near Israel, joined by a full squadron of F-15E Strike Eagles from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base and another squadron of Lakenheath's own F-15Es. Numerous F-16 Fighting Falcons and A-10 Thunderbolt attack aircraft were also stationed across the region, with additional fighters positioned as far away as Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, confirmed through satellite imagery. At sea, the picture was equally dense. The aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford, carrying squadrons of FA-18 fighters and EA-18 Growler electronic attack aircraft, was reported to be arriving near the coast of Israel within days, while the USS Abraham Lincoln, with its own complement of F-35Cs, FA-18s, and EA-18s, was already positioned in waters south of Iran. This was not a token gesture. This was, according to multiple outlets covering the buildup independently, one of the largest concentrations of American air and naval power assembled in the region in decades. Then, on February 28, 2026, the buildup became a war. The United States joined Israel in a coordinated wave of strikes against Iran's missile forces and other military targets, an operation that has since been referred to in defense reporting as Operation Epic Fury, according to an account published by MIGFLUG, which tracks military aviation deployments. In the days that followed, F-22 Raptors flew more than 200 combat sorties, reportedly threading Iranian air defenses without ever being detected, described as the classic first-night mission that only a true stealth fighter can perform. The logic behind that mission is straightforward, and it's worth explaining plainly. The F-22 was never designed primarily to drop bombs on cities or fixed installations. It was designed to establish air superiority, to clear hostile aircraft from contested skies and suppress enemy air defense systems, so that other aircraft, whether B-2 bombers, F-15E strike jets, or Navy fighters launching from carriers, could operate with a dramatically reduced risk of being shot down. Analysis published by 1945 described this specific dynamic in stark terms, characterizing the B-2 and F-22 combination as having decapitated significant portions of Iran's integrated air defense network within the first 72 hours of the campaign. Facing a dramatically weakened conventional air force, 1945 noted that Iran's fighter fleet remained badly outmatched in any direct air-to-air engagement. Tehran responded the way military analysts had largely expected it would. Not with fighter jets, but with missiles and drones aimed outward at American partners across the Gulf. According to a documented account on Wikipedia sourced to statements from Qatar's Ministry of Defense, Iran launched ballistic missile strikes against Arab countries hosting American forces in early March 2026. One missile was intercepted by Qatari air defenses. A second struck Al Udeid Air Base directly, though it caused no human casualties there. Falling debris did ignite a fire in a food storage warehouse nearby. Saudi Arabia was also targeted repeatedly during this period, according to the same sourced account, with missile and drone attacks aimed at military sites, oil infrastructure, and sensitive areas near the capital, the eastern provinces, and the Empty Quarter. Separately, other reported strikes on Arab countries during this stretch of the war were described as killing 7 people and injuring 18 others, underscoring that even with American and Israeli air superiority largely established, the human cost of the conflict was not confined to Iranian territory alone. The war did not remain one-sided in terms of American losses either, and an honest telling of the story requires saying so clearly. On April 3, 2026, an F-15E Strike Eagle, assigned to the 494th Fighter Squadron, was shot down over Iran, in Kogaluya and Boyer Ahmad Province, according to a detailed sourced account documented on Wikipedia. What followed was a major combat search and rescue operation spanning 2 days, from April 3 to April 5, involving the Air Force's 427th Special Operations Squadron, Air Force Para-Rescue Men, Army Delta Force operators, the the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, Navy Special Warfare personnel, and reported CIA involvement. Both crew members from the downed F-15E were recovered. The pilot was rescued roughly 7 hours after the crash. The operation involved hundreds of U.S. troops and dozens of aircraft, according to the same documented account, and it came at a cost on both sides. 2 crew members from the F-15E were injured, along with additional personnel aboard the rescue helicopters. On the Iranian side, the operation reportedly resulted in the deaths of 3 IRGC members and 4 Iranian army officers. American forces also destroyed several of their own aircraft during the operation to prevent them from falling into hostile hands, while Iran claimed to have shot down an A-10 Thunderbolt and an MQ-9 Reaper drone during the engagement, a claim that, per standard practice in conflict reporting, should be treated as an Iranian assertion rather than independently confirmed fact, since combat loss claims by any party in an active war zone often carry incentives toward exaggeration or spin. That shootdown became a pivot point in how American defense analysts talked about the war. An article published by 1945 in early April argued that the Iran conflict was exposing real strain in the U.S. Air Force's fighter structure in real time, noting that while stealth aircraft like the F-22 and B-2 had opened the campaign by suppressing air defenses, sustained combat operations had increasingly shifted onto non-stealth platforms like the F-15E, which face substantially higher risk once they're operating inside contested airspace for extended periods. The same reporting noted that the United States had fired more than 850 Tomahawk cruise missiles in the span of a single month during the conflict, a pace so intense that it reportedly delayed weapons deliveries to allied nations elsewhere in the world. Air Force Chief of Staff General David Alvin was cited discussing the service's long-term answer to these pressures, a 3-part fighter strategy combining an upgraded Raptor 2, Zerso version of the F-22 with stealth external fuel tanks and infrared search and track pods, more than 1,700 F-35As once a delayed software upgrade called Block 4 is fully fielded, and a next-generation aircraft called the F-47, which the Air Force expects to eventually field in greater numbers than it ever fielded F-22s, partly by integrating it with uncrewed collaborative combat aircraft flying alongside it. Before moving on to how the war evolved, it's worth explaining why the F-22 in particular carries so much symbolic and operational weight whenever it shows up in a story like this one, because that context shapes how seriously analysts treated its arrival at Ovda. The Raptor entered service in the mid-2000s, and production was halted years ago after fewer than 200 combat-coded jets were ever built, a decision driven largely by the enormous per-unit cost of the program and a post-Cold War assumption, later revisited, that a dedicated superiority fighter of this caliber wouldn't be needed at scale. That scarcity is precisely why every deployment of F-22s to a live conflict zone gets tracked so closely by aviation analysts and open-source intelligence communities. There simply aren't very many of them. The Air Force treats each one as an irreplaceable asset. The aircraft's reputation for evading detection isn't just marketing language either. 1945 has documented a now well-known 2013 incident in which an F-22 escorting an American drone near Iranian airspace quietly intercepted 2 aging Iranian F-4 Phantom fighters that had moved to engage the drone. The Raptor pilot reportedly slipped underneath the lead F-4 undetected, inspected its weapons loadout, then pulled alongside the aircraft, still unseen, before breaking radio silence to deliver a blunt warning that sent the Iranian jets home. That single incident, more than a decade before the events of this year, is part of why so many defense analysts treated Iran's inability to detect the Raptors flying into its airspace in February and March of 2026 as entirely consistent with the aircraft's track record rather than as a surprise. The F-22's presence in the broader Central Command region also wasn't new by 2026, even if forward basing in Israel specifically was. Air and Space Forces magazine has documented earlier rotations of Raptors through the Middle East, tied to rising tension with Iran, including a period in 2024 when a full squadron was rushed from Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson in Alaska to the region following Israel's killing of Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. During that earlier deployment, F-22 pilots from the 90th Fighter Squadron described a genuinely difficult and evolving threat environment, one shaped less by traditional fighter-versus-fighter combat and more by a proliferation of drones and cruise missiles operated by Iran-backed groups across Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. One pilot involved in that effort, Major Benjamin Coffey of the 494th Fighter Squadron, was later awarded the Silver Star for shooting down several of those drones while flying an F-15E, and reportedly wrote an internal paper on tactics for engaging small drone targets that other pilots in the region drew on directly. That kind of institutional knowledge, built up over roughly 2 years of recurring Iran-related deployments, is part of why the Air Force was able to move so quickly once the February 2026 talks collapsed. This wasn't an unfamiliar theater for these squadrons. even if the specific step of basing at Ovda was new. The diplomatic run-up to the February collapse also deserves a bit more texture than a single date can convey. In the weeks before talks formally broke down, President Trump had already signaled significant frustration with the pace and substance of negotiations, telling reporters he was, in his words, not happy with how the Iran talks were going, and that he had not yet made a final decision on whether to authorize American strikes. Remarks picked up and repeated by Fox News as the administration's public posture hardened. The kind of ambiguity, a president publicly withholding a final decision while simultaneously authorizing the largest movement of fifth-generation fighters toward the region in years, is itself a documented feature of how this crisis unfolded. And it left both allies and adversaries reading troop movements as more informative than public statements. Separately, the recommendation to expand American basing options inside Israel wasn't invented on the fly either. The Jewish Institute for National Security of America had published a report the previous fall specifically arguing that forward basing in Israel would meaningfully enhance American flexibility and deterrence posture in the region, an idea the organization's Fellow for American Strategy, Jonathan Rue, said the February deployment effectively validated once it happened. The war's footprint also extended beyond the immediate combat zone in ways that outlasted the fighting itself. Reporting has traced a separate diplomatic friction point emerging months later in Bulgaria, where the country's parliament debated approving continued American use of a base in the southeastern part of the country, tied to the broader tanker and logistics network supporting Middle East operations, described by MIGFLUG as becoming a point of friction between Tehran and Western governments, even as combat operations themselves were winding down. A reminder that the infrastructure behind an air campaign like this one, the tankers, the basing agreements, and the logistics chains, tends to generate its own slower-moving political consequences, long after the fighter jets themselves have moved on. None of that diminishes the central role the F-22 played at the outset of the campaign, but it does illustrate how a single stealth fighter's few hundred combat sorties sit inside a much larger, slower-moving apparatus of alliances, refueling routes, and parliamentary approvals that rarely make it into a single dramatic headline. Through the spring, the F-22s continued operating out of Ovda, providing sustained air superiority coverage as the broader campaign against Iranian targets continued. But wars involving this level of high-end American military commitment are, almost by definition, temporary in their most intense phase, and by summer the posture in the region had visibly begun to shift. According to reporting from Defense Security Asia, published roughly 4 weeks ago, the United States began withdrawing its F-22 Raptors from Ovda Air Base, a move the outlet was careful to frame accurately. This was described not necessarily as a reduction in America's ability to rapidly project combat power into the Middle East, but as a transition from wartime surge operations toward a more sustainable, longer-term regional posture, while preserving the option to surge forces back in again if future contingencies with Iran demanded it. A separate account from MIGFLUG described the Raptors as having flown out of the region toward RAF Fairford in the United Kingdom, closing out what the outlet characterized as roughly 4 months of continuous forward deployment tied directly to the Iran conflict, a period that began with that first arrival at Ovda in late February and extended through the peak combat operations of Operation Epic Fury, the missile exchanges with Gulf states, the F-15E shoot-down and rescue in April, and the gradual stabilization of the front through the following months. So where does that leave things today? This is where the story requires a bit of honest caution because in the days just before this video was put together, a video began circulating on social media that claimed to show something new. Footage described by several accounts as an American F-22 carrying out a fresh airstrike on an Iranian military airbase, complete with fighter jets bombing positions, while ground-based air defenses attempted to engage them. That footage spread quickly across accounts on the platform X in the first days of August 2026. But according to a fact check published by Misbar, a dedicated verification outlet, that video was not real combat footage at all. It was traced back to a military simulation video game, unrelated to any actual recent military operation involving Iran. The fact check specifically identified the footage as originating from Arma 3, a well-known combat simulation game frequently repurposed in online misinformation about real conflicts around the world. It's a useful and honest reminder for anyone following this story closely. The real F-22 operations against Iran happened. They were extensively documented by named outlets and open-source flight tracking analysts throughout the spring and early summer of 2026, and the aircraft have since been drawn down from their forward positions. As of the most recent reporting available, there is no verified evidence of a new F-22 strike on Iran in the days immediately preceding this video's release. Anyone circulating that video as current breaking footage is circulating something false. Stepping back from the day-to-day timeline, it's worth thinking about what this entire episode actually demonstrated about the F-22 as a weapons platform and about the underlying logic of deterrence itself. The Raptor has always occupied an unusual position in American military aviation. It was designed in the late Cold War and early post-Cold War period specifically to counter advanced Soviet, and later Russian and Chinese, fighter aircraft in a high-end air-to-air fight. Production ended more than a decade ago, with fewer than 200 combat-coded aircraft ever built, making it one of the rarest and most closely guarded assets in the entire American arsenal. Unlike the F-35, which was built from the outset as a multi-role aircraft capable of striking ground targets, gathering intelligence, and fighting other aircraft all in a single airframe, the F-22's core mission has always remained narrower and more specialized. That is precisely the role it played over Iran in the early hours of Operation Epic Fury. Not the aircraft dropping the most bombs and not the aircraft generating the most headlines in the days that followed, but the aircraft that made everything that came after it possible. There's also a broader lesson in how this episode played out politically, separate from the purely military dimension. The decision to forward base F-22s in Israel wasn't made in a vacuum, and it wasn't universally embraced by every regional partner. Reporting from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies noted that several Arab governments had declared that their airspace or territory could not be used for strikes on Iran, a stance that reportedly undercut some American negotiating leverage during the diplomatic phase, and, in the analysis's own framing, may have emboldened Iranian negotiators who remain largely inflexible on core American demands throughout. That detail matters because it illustrates something often missing from purely military coverage of these episodes. Even the most advanced stealth fighter in the world operates inside a web of alliance politics, basing rights and diplomatic sensitivities that shape exactly how, when, and from where it can actually be used. A jet that is functionally undetectable on radars, still entirely dependent on the political willingness of host nations to let it operate from their soil, and on tanker aircraft to keep it fueled across distances that stealth alone cannot shrink. It's also worth being transparent about what remains genuinely contested or unverified in this story, because a responsible accounting of any active or recent conflict has to acknowledge where the fog of war hasn't fully cleared. Iran's claims about shooting down an A-10 and an MQ-9 Reaper during the April rescue operation have not been independently confirmed by American sources in the reporting reviewed for this account. Claims made by combatant governments about their own battlefield successes should generally be treated with appropriate skepticism until corroborated by other parties or physical evidence. Central Command has consistently declined to comment on the specifics of these operations when asked directly by reporters. That reticence is standard practice for operational security reasons, but it does mean that a portion of this story rests on credible reporting and open-source analysis rather than on-the-record government statements. It's worth adding a final layer of nuance about how the F-22's role compared with the other stealth platform involved in this campaign, the B-2 Spirit, since the two are sometimes conflated in casual conversation but perform genuinely different jobs. The B-2, as a long-range bomber, is built to penetrate defended airspace and deliver large payloads against hardened, high-value targets, the kind of mission it carried out during Operation Midnight Hammer against Iranian nuclear facilities back in June 2025. The F-22, by contrast, doesn't carry anywhere near that payload and was never intended to. Its job in this campaign was almost entirely about control of the airspace itself, hunting for Iranian fighters that might scramble to intercept incoming strike packages, and using its sensor suite to identify and help neutralize surface-to-air missile sites before they could threaten less stealthy aircraft following behind. That division of labor, bombers for hardened targets, Raptors for clearing and holding the sky, is precisely the stealth-surge combination that 1945's analysis credited with degrading Iran's integrated air defenses so quickly in the campaign's opening days. Neither aircraft could have done the other's job as efficiently, and defense analysts have pointed to this pairing, specifically as validation of a targeting doctrine, the Air Force has been refining since long before this particular conflict began. Taken together, though, the core narrative here is unusually well documented for a modern conflict, precisely because so much of it played out in the open, visible on commercial satellite imagery, tracked by civilian flight monitoring communities, and reported independently by outlets ranging from Air and Space Forces magazine and The Aviationist to Fox News, Army Recognition, and 1945, along with sourced citation-backed timelines maintained on Wikipedia covering the broader 2026 Iran war and its individual operations, where this account has flagged claims as unverified or contested. Iranian claims of downing American aircraft during the April rescue operation, and the precise operational tactics used by F-22 pilots to evade detection. That flag should be taken seriously by anyone using this material for further research or reporting of their own. There's one more piece of context worth including here, because it speaks directly to how the Air Force itself is thinking about the next decade, not just this particular conflict. General Alvin's comments about fielding a Raptor upgrade, a fully realized F-35 fleet, and the new F-47 weren't offered in a vacuum. They were offered specifically in the context of analysts asking whether the current fighter force could sustain another conflict of this intensity without running into serious readiness problems. Munition stockpiles, not just airframes, are finite, and the Iran war of 2026 appears to have drawn on them at a pace that outstripped what many planners had assumed would be necessary. That kind of routine, peacetime training is rarely covered with the same intensity as an actual deployment, but it's part of the reason units were able to surge into the Central Command Theater on short notice once the February 2026 order came down. Pilots and maintenance crews weren't starting from a cold readiness posture. They were drawing on recent, realistic training cycles that had specifically anticipated a scenario like this one. What's left, ultimately, is a story about what deterrence actually looks like when it's tested in real time, rather than just talked about in press briefings. The F-22 didn't need to win a dogfight to prove its value in this conflict. It needed to disappear from Iranian radar screens long enough to let the rest of the American and Israeli air campaign unfold with far less risk than it otherwise would have carried. It did that job for roughly 4 months, based out of a Cold War-era airfield in the Israeli desert that had sat mostly empty since 2025, before quietly heading home once the most intense phase of the fighting had passed. Whether that kind of forward-deployed air power actually shortens future conflicts with Iran, or whether it simply resets the clock until the next round of tension, is a genuinely open question, and reasonable people who follow this region closely disagree on the answer. Some argue that visible, credible deterrence, jets sitting on a runway within reach of Tehran, is exactly what prevents wars from escalating further. Others argue that forward-basing exquisite, irreplaceable assets like the F-22 so close to a live conflict zone creates its own risks, and that the real lesson of April's F-15E shootdown is how quickly even a dominant air campaign can produce casualties nobody predicted at the outset. So here's the honest question worth sitting with, rather than a manufactured call to action. Given everything laid out here, the buildup, the strikes, the shoot-down and rescue, the missile exchanges with Gulf states, and now the drawdown, do you think forward-basing America's most advanced fighters this close to Iran actually reduces the odds of a wider war? Or does it just guarantee that the next escalation starts from an even higher baseline than the last one? That's worth thinking through on your own terms. Thanks for spending this time working through the timeline with me, and I'll see you in the next one.